In the next hour, we will together learn about protecting water quality through our nutrient reduction strategy. Our first speaker, Joe Bunnell, is the Nutrient Reduction Strategy Coordinator in the Department of Natural Resources located in Madison. And Joe, I will let you take it away.
All right, thanks, Amber. I'm going to share my screen here. How's that look?
That looks great.
Awesome. Thanks, Amber, for the opportunity to talk to your audience, and thanks to Amber's team for all your support leading up to and during the webinar. It's very much appreciated. So I am going to be talking about Wisconsin's nutrient loss reduction strategy, and so let's just dig right in. So I'm going to cover three broad areas. I'm going to talk about why we need a nutrient loss reduction strategy, talk a little bit about what exactly is a nutrient loss reduction strategy. I'll talk about our process for creating a new nutrient loss reduction strategy, and hopefully be able to convince you all that this is something that you ought to be involved in and how you can do that. So let's start with the big question. Why would we need a nutrient loss reduction strategy? Well, what is a nutrient loss reduction strategy? It deals with nitrogen and phosphorus, and we know that high levels of nitrogen and phosphorus in our surface and groundwater cause problems. They cause problems of human health, especially nitrates in groundwater. It can affect recreation. You know, we've all heard about beach closings because of harmful algal blooms. And it also can affect fish and wildlife. In other words, our aquatic ecosystems are affected by having too many nutrients in the water. So, we know that too many nutrients getting into our surface and groundwater is an issue. But what do we know about nitrogen and phosphorus in our surface and groundwater in Wisconsin? I'm just going to cover a couple of different statistics here to remind us of whether or not these are actually important issues. So first, I want to talk about, Wisconsin every couple of years does an assessment of our surface waters, and they determine which of those surface waters that they have monitored are attaining water quality standards. When they find that they are not attaining standards, they have to identify what the known causes are for not meeting those standards. So if you look at the 2018 data, when Wisconsin said to EPA, these are the water bodies, there are over 1,000 water bodies that were not meeting attainment that were reported in 2018. They determined that 47% of those water bodies not attaining water quality standards, it was due to high levels of phosphorus. So in other words, 47% of those over 1,000 water bodies that were not meeting attainment was due to phosphorus. And that's the number one reason for our water bodies, our surface water bodies, to not be attaining water quality standards. So phosphorus is obviously a big issue. So again, 47% of the lakes and streams that were not meeting water quality standards, that was due to phosphorus. So let's talk about nitrogen. We don't use nitrogen in Wisconsin because we don't have numeric criteria or standards for nitrogen in our surface waters, but we can talk about long-term trends in terms of the amount of nitrogen in our surface water. So each of these dots on this map is a monitoring site, a long-term monitoring site. So this is taken from data from 2000 to 2020, so a 20-year period. If it's a orangish dot, that means that they're seeing increasing nitrogen in those surface waters. If it's gray or blue, it's either neutral or reducing nitrogen. And the size of the circle means the amount of increase or decrease. So you can see there's quite a few larger circles here in orange or reddish color, indicating that over that 20-year period, long-term monitoring sites were seeing a general or a gradual increase in the amount of nitrogen in those water bodies. We also know that nitrates are an issue in groundwater. This map shows for each county an estimate of the percentage of private wells that are over the 10 milligram per liter of nitrate in those private wells. So the 10 milligram per liter is a health standard. And so the darker the county, the higher the percentage of private wells are expected to be over that 10 milligram per liter health limit. So you can see that quite a few counties in Wisconsin have, anywhere from 5 to over 20% of their private wells that are over the nitrate standard. So we know that nitrates in groundwater are an issue in Wisconsin. What are the sources of this nitrogen and phosphorus? How is it getting into our surface and groundwater? Well, we know that point sources are an issue. Wastewater treatment plants can put out quite a bit of phosphorus. Those plants are covered under a permitting system, a Wisconsin pollutant discharge elimination system. So they're pretty heavily regulated, and we've been pretty successful. Between the years of 1995 to 2018, DNR was able to document a 70% reduction in the amount or the pounds of phosphorus coming out of wastewater treatment facilities. So that's a pretty significant reduction between 1995 and 2018. But there are also lots of non-point sources, meaning not necessarily coming out of a pipe, but generally like running off the landscape. And we know that those sources include agriculture, urban stormwater, and construction sites. So the urban stormwater and construction sites are also, I'm not going to say heavily regulated, but they are regulated. So if you're a large municipality, you have to have an urban stormwater permit. You have to demonstrate that you're taking steps to reduce the amount of pollutants that are getting into your stormwaters. And construction sites have to implement certain practices like you see in the picture over on the right to try to reduce particularly soil erosion from those construction sites. And then a third source, we could say kind of in quotes, in air quotes, natural sources. Those include stream bank erosion and then the sediments that can contain a lot of phosphorus in particular that can get resuspended and into the water column. So the reason I put natural sources in air quotes is like in the picture in the example to the right, yes, that soil is eroding into the stream. The reason, though, that it might have high phosphorus is because of practices on the landscape. So there is a lot of legacy phosphorus in our soils. And then when those soils erode in stream bank erosion, then that phosphorus gets back into the water column. So while stream bank erosion and sediments from streams and lakes could be considered natural, a lot of the phosphorus that's in those sediments came from land use practices like agriculture. So again, why do we need a nutrient loss reduction strategy? If we know what the problem is, we know that there are issues and impacts from nitrogen and phosphorus, but why would we need a nutrient loss reduction strategy? You might say, for example, but Joe, we have lots of policies to address nutrient loss. For example, NR 151, that is supposed to help to prevent agricultural runoff of nutrients. We also have our point source program. So we've got lots of policies. We've got lots of programs. For example, there are lots of cost share programs that farmers can participate in to help cover the costs of reducing their nutrient loss. We also have lots of plans. Each farm may have a nutrient management plan of its own. We also have watershed plans all over the state, and each county has a land and water resource management plan. So, gosh, it seems like we've got lots of plans, programs, and policies already. And probably most importantly, we've got people all over the state and lots of agencies and with lots of expertise who are working very hard to implement these programs and plans. So why do we need a nutrient loss reduction strategy if we've got all these assets out there working to try to reduce nutrient loss? Well, if you'll permit a little digression here, I want to offer a sports analogy. So let's assume that you've got a professional football team that's just full of all-stars. Like everyone on the team is an all-star, the best team you could possibly put on the field. But let's assume that the owner, right before the big game, tells the coaches, you know what? I want you to throw away your game plan. I want you to burn the playbooks, and we're not going to have any huddles. We're just going to, every play, everyone on the team, they're all stars. They know what they're doing. We're just going to let them do the best thing that they know how to do. So on each snap of the ball, all the players are going, I have no idea what everybody else on the team is going to do. I'm going to do my best. I'm going to run a route, or I'm going to run the ball, or I'm going to block, but I don't know what the big plan is. That's kind of where we are without a statewide nutrient loss reduction strategy. We've got lots of people out there doing really good things and lots of plans scattered around, but we don't all know what we're all trying to accomplish. What's the big picture plan? What's the big strategy? And how are we going to get there together? So let's assume that we do need a nutrient loss reduction strategy. What is a nutrient loss reduction strategy? Well, first, it's going to tell us what is it that we're trying to accomplish. It's going to identify the problems and the sources, and it's going to identify the goals and objectives, broad scale, big scale, statewide. What are our goals and objectives? What are we trying to accomplish in terms of nutrient loss reduction? It should also say something about how we're going to get there. What are the big strategies? Where are we going to invest our time and resources and energies in a big picture sense to try to reduce nutrient loss? It should also address what are the resources that we have available to us. As I indicated in the previous slide, there are lots of assets out there already, but they're not always necessarily working on the same page and working in coordination toward the same vision, strategic vision. A nutrient loss reduction strategy should also talk about where and how we're going to focus and coordinate all these great assets and resources that we have. And that's really probably the biggest thing that a nutrient loss reduction strategy will offer us. And some of the keys to success in terms of what makes for a good nutrient loss reduction strategy, well, it should be science-based, right? We should have reason to believe that we're attacking the problems that there's clear evidence for, and that we're doing it in a way that is backed by not just, like agronomic science, but also by, say, the social science. Like, okay, if we're going to ask farmers to adopt practices, what do we know are the ways that work to work with farmers in order to have them adopt those practices? It also should have broad-based input and support because it requires the support of a wide range of and a lot of individuals, from the farmer at the farm level all the way up to state agencies. We should all have a common sense of where we're trying to get to and how we're going to get there. And then there should also be accountability. We should have a way of determining whether or not we are moving towards our objectives and goals. So there needs to be a really robust monitoring plan to go with the strategy. So many of you may not be aware of it, but we actually do have a nutrient reduction strategy or nutrient loss reduction strategy in place. It was published in 2013, put together by a partnership of state agencies and federal agencies. And the strengths of that strategy are that they did a really good job of compiling the data around nitrogen and phosphorus and the trends in surface water in particular. Also, they talked about groundwater. They identified priority watersheds, so they used that data to identify which are the watersheds where we have the highest amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus getting into our surface water and groundwater. So we're going to prioritize those. They also identified nutrient reduction goals in terms of what percentage of nutrients do we need to reduce in order to get back to healthy rivers and streams and lakes. And then they did a really good job of identifying the existing policies and programs, those assets that we've got out there that we are already in place and that we're utilizing to try to accomplish those goals. But what the current nutrient loss reduction strategy doesn't do, well, or what are its weaknesses? Well, there's a heavy focus on phosphorus in surface water, partly because we have numeric criteria for phosphorus in surface water, but the bulk of the emphasis of that plan was on phosphorus in surface water, much less so on nitrogen, both in surface water and groundwater. There also wasn't a major stakeholder engagement effort with the first nutrient reduction strategy. And I think that's largely because of the last weakness, which is there really weren't strategies put in place with this nutrient loss reduction strategy. It was really more a compilation of here is what we're doing, here's how we are trying, across agencies, working to try to reduce nutrient loss. But there wasn't a new vision proposed or a strategy for where are we going to focus our attention and resources. So there wasn't really a huge reason to engage stakeholders because we weren't really trying to formulate a new pathway or a new vision. So that's the old strategy. And I was hired a couple of years ago to help develop a new nutrient loss reduction strategy. You may have noticed that I've kind of toggled between nutrient reduction and nutrient loss reduction strategy. The initial strategy was called a nutrient reduction strategy, but as we were developing the new one, there was consensus that calling it a nutrient loss reduction strategy was really more accurate, and a lot of other states have adopted that terminology too. So going forward, we're calling it a nutrient loss reduction strategy. So we know that there is an opportunity and there are needs, and that was part of the reason that I was hired to help develop a new strategy. So there is funding from the federal government to support my position and to support the development of the new strategy and also implementation going forward. So we have some federal funds that help to create this new strategy and put it in place. There's also an opportunity to identify a strategic direction, something that I mentioned was missing from the first strategy. So now we're looking to actually focus our attention, narrow our scope, and identify some strategic directions that we can all be working towards. Because if we're all working on all strategies and all objectives and all opportunities, then we're not making the best use of our assets. We also want to incorporate all the scientific advances that have happened in terms of monitoring and telling us where the problems are and using modeling to identify where all these nutrients are coming from. And then there's also a lot of advances in knowing what are the practices that are going to be most effective at reducing nutrient loss from the landscape. And then lastly, but probably most importantly, we want to broaden the participation and ownership because we are developing a strategic vision. We are trying to focus resources on what's working and away from what's not working. And so we need to hear from and we need participation from the folks who are on the ground, on the landscape and making decisions about how we address nutrient loss. So I want to talk a little bit about what our structure is for developing this new nutrient loss reduction strategy. So it starts with DNR. So DNR is the agency that was tasked with developing the nutrient loss reduction strategy. However, DNR is not the only partner, certainly, in addressing nutrient loss. So we created an interagency water quality work group to help work with DNR as partners to develop the new strategy. The interagency water quality work group is made up of representatives of DNR plus these other federal and state agencies, Natural Resource Conservation Service, Wisconsin Land and Water, U.S. Geological Survey, UW-Madison Extension and UW-Madison in general, and the Department of Ag, Trade, and Consumer Protection. So all of these agencies and organizations, institutions have representatives on the Interagency Water Quality Work Group that are helping DNR put together the new nutrient loss reduction strategy. But there's a key partner missing here, and that's our stakeholders. And so in the process of developing the strategy, we are consulting with our stakeholders, and today's webinar is really kind of the launching point for that process that I'll talk about more here in a minute. So just to give you all a sense of our timeline, we are hoping to have this strategy completed by the end of this calendar year. It all began with my being hired to coordinate this process back in September of 2023. Our steering committee met for the first time in January of 2024. And we've worked through this process of defining the problem to try and all get on the same page of, okay, let's remind ourselves, where are the nutrients coming from? What are the transport pathways? What's the science behind nutrients getting into surface and groundwater? And then we also have started, we've got some draft objectives. So after looking at the problem, we identified, okay, here are the objectives that we think should be the focus of our attention moving forward. But those are draft objectives, and we all agreed that we are at a stage in the process where we really want to be focusing on stakeholder engagement. But before we talk about that, I want to give you a view of the draft objectives. These have been shortened a little bit, so just for the sake of the presentation, but we identified 3 categories of objectives. There are environmental, social and economic, institutional, and organizational. And I'm going to take a pause here for about 30 seconds to just give everyone a chance to read through these. So again, these are draft objectives. They've been shortened up a little bit just for brevity for the purpose of the presentation, and I'm happy to share the full objectives. And these are what we're calling ends objectives. We also, for each of these ends objectives, we've got sets of means objectives, meaning, okay, how would we actually accomplish these ends objectives? And again, happy to share those with anyone who would like to see them. We're going to be posting those on our website here probably in the next couple of weeks. But this gives you a sense of kind of the breadth and the general sense of what the Interagency Water Quality Work Group has come up with in terms of objectives for the nutrient loss reduction strategy. But we're looking for input into this and other aspects of the strategy. And so that's what the stakeholder engagement process is all about, that we're going to be engaging in here very soon. So when I talk about stakeholder engagement, who am I talking about? Well, it's all the groups listed here, but it's also basically anyone who feels like they have a vested interest and a desire to participate in crafting the next nutrient loss reduction strategy. How are we going to reach out? Well, this is part of the process, the introductory webinars. We're going to have a couple of more introductory webinars for people to learn about the strategy and what we're doing. We're also going to be holding listening sessions around the state, and we're going to try to get word out so that everyone who wants to participate in a listening session has an opportunity to come in and tell us from their perspective what's working, what's not working, what should be our future directions and our priorities. And we're also going to be updating DNR's nutrient reduction strategy webpage to a nutrient loss reduction strategy webpage with information about our process. And the presentations, we're starting right now. We're going to have probably go into March with the presentations. Listening sessions will probably be happening between March and June. And then the updates should be coming here in a couple of weeks. How are we going to be using all the input that we get from all these stakeholders? Well, we're going to be taking notes, copious notes during all of the listening sessions. We're going to be looking for themes around what's working, what's not working in terms of program implementation, what policies, what relationships, what partnerships, what messages are working. And we'll be asking folks where to focus our attention and resources. And we're going to be summarizing all that, bringing that back into the interagency water quality work group, which will use those themes to refine and prioritize the objectives that I showed you, and then to develop strategies based on everything that they've heard to support and enhance what we've heard folks say is working out on the landscape or could be working better. And then we will obviously evaluate. We'll take all that information back into our respective agencies and institutions and evaluate and align our programs and policies to support those broad statewide strategies. And our desired outcomes, hopefully at the end of this all, we'll have a shared vision and strategies for reducing nutrient loss in Wisconsin. There will hopefully be increased cooperation among agencies, their partners, and the stakeholders in order to accomplish that shared vision. We anticipate that there will be broad support for and commitment to the strategies because all the key people have been part of bringing this together and formulating the new strategy. And ultimately, obviously, what we really want in the end is improved water quality. And then as a lead into the next presentation, some additional outcomes would be a social science assessment, which we are funding with UW to look at what are the incentives and barriers to adoption of the practices that we know need to be adopted on the landscape to reduce nutrient loss. And then Stephen's going to talk more about the Ag BMP science assessment, so I won't say any more about that. And if you want more information, please contact me. I'm happy to share more information or answer your questions, hear your perspectives. And I think we're going to put the link to the website up in the chat, but just be aware that the updates won't be coming for about another week or two. But they will be there soon, and there will be information about how to get involved and participate in some of those listening sessions. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing.
That was great. Thank you, Joe. Yes, the link to the current information on the DNR website about the current nutrient reduction strategy is in the chat. So thanks. That was a really great presentation. Appreciate you putting it together. It was a really nice look into the past and the future direction. So as we're transitioning to our next speaker, we're going to launch a quick poll to collect some demographic information from you. So this anonymous information helps us to evaluate the audiences that we're reaching with this type of work. We really appreciate you for filling out the polls as always. And just as a heads up, there'll be another poll question at the end of the webinar that asks you about today's webinar topic and future participation with the nutrient loss reduction strategy process. Answering those questions really helps us improve future programs. And so if you take a moment to answer that when you leave the webinar, we will be very, very grateful. All right, I'm just going to give the poll one more minute. Stephen, looks like you're able to share. That's fantastic. I'm starting to see the poll results leveling out a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead. Great. Thank you, Kelsey. All right, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our second speaker, Dr. Stephen Hall. Stephen is assistant professor in the Department of Plant and Agroecosystem Sciences at UW-Madison. Stephen, go ahead and take it away.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Amber. And this follows really nicely where Joe left off. So let's see. All right, so really the goal with the science assessment, as Joe mentioned, is to dive in deeper and really begin to better understand the impacts of various agricultural management practices on nutrient losses to surface waters. So we're really envisioning this as a long-term process. For the short term, for the next year, our team's focus is really going to be on phosphorus, but we're not neglecting nitrogen. Phosphorus is up first. And really our philosophy with this is to be descriptive, not prescriptive, right? Not telling the community what to do, but get a better sense of the menu of options that are out there for reducing nutrients from agriculture. And so the structure of this effort, so we have what we're calling an advisory committee of about 10 scientists, primarily UW-Madison faculty and staff and some other folks from Extension. And so we began meeting late last fall, and we're really just sort of jumping into this now. And I think we're fortunate to be able to build off of the efforts of some of our other neighboring states in our region that have not only done nutrient reduction strategies but also had science assessments in conjunction. And I'll briefly highlight some efforts from Iowa, where I was, have some good connections and ongoing collaboration with faculty there. And thankfully, there's really a robust group of scientists across the region that are collaborating on this, and so we can, build on that knowledge. And so back in 2012. Folks in Iowa released their science assessment of synthesizing sort of the best available information as to how different agricultural practices affected nitrogen and phosphorus losses to surface waters. And so they've been steadily updating those results over the years. And thought I'd briefly share some of their results from 2012 to give you a sense of what they did. And so they took a number of different practices. Here I'm showing you a table of the practices related to phosphorus, and then expressed the phosphorus load reduction that could be achieved by those practices. And so I want you to focus on this red box here, which shows you the average phosphorus load reduction as well as the standard deviation in parentheses. And what you'll notice is, perhaps not surprising to folks that are working in this space, is the tremendous variability in the performance of these different practices. For many of these, the standard deviation is actually greater than the mean, right? And I think when it comes to actually thinking about broader scale solutions, this is really a challenge, right? Where is this variability coming from, and what does it mean if we're trying to scale up the implementation of these practices? Focus on one in particular, right? We know there's a lot of potential for cover crops with respect to both nitrogen and phosphorus reduction. But when we look at the data from Iowa, right, for winter rye, we're seeing an average reduction of 29% of the phosphorus load. So not bad, but again, the standard deviation is 37%. So in some cases, it appears some of these practices are not particularly effective. And so we're really interested in as a team in understanding better what factors are actually driving this variability and whether they're predictable. And I think to do this, we need to dive in a little bit deeper and think about the kinds of data sets that are actually used to generate this information. And so in the case of the Iowa Science Assessment, they were relying on peer-reviewed field studies from Iowa and neighboring states. Obviously, that includes Wisconsin. So Wisconsin data is already included in some of the science assessment efforts of our neighboring states. That's great. And so these studies had to include explicit treatments and controls, right? So this is really robust from a scientific perspective. It gives us some confidence maybe that a certain kinds of practice is actually having an effect. But it also really poses a challenge because for many of these kinds of practices, we just have very little data in terms of, rigorous field experiments. And so when we look at this cover crop number, this is coming from only 6 site years of data, right? And so that's really, a potential challenge when we're thinking about broader scale implementation of our best management practices. And sort of, dive into this a little bit more, right? In an ideal world, right, we would be evaluating these different kinds of practices in working agricultural fields where we're establishing plots, right? So these rectangles here are field plots. We're going to randomly assign some of these to treatments, randomly assign some of them to controls. We're going to measure nutrient losses from surface or subsurface flow and get a good number for what that practice is potentially doing, right? But really the challenge is, as we all know, there's a lot of context dependency of these different kinds of practices. These field plots are out in real fields across complex landscapes with differing soil types, topography, different cropping systems, climate. You have it, right? We know agriculture is diverse, especially in a state like Wisconsin. And so it really becomes a challenging endeavor to try to estimate the average effect of a given practice while accounting for all of that variability. I think that's really one of the challenges that we're facing. And so what our group is proposing to do over the next year is, leverage a couple of unique tools that we have in Wisconsin. So using our Wisconsin Phosphorus Index and taking advantage of a wealth of data from Wisconsin discovery farms in terms of surface water nutrient losses to dial in a little more on some of these practices. Okay, so most of the folks on this webinar are probably well familiar with the Wisconsin Phosphorus Index. So just to review, right, this is a quantitative tool that can help us evaluate the risk of phosphorus loss in surface runoff. So we're estimating the annual phosphorus loss as a function of field area using some equations that count for factors like your differing crop management practices, your rotation history, attributes of your soils, and climate in any particular region. And so we're using some, semi-mechanistic models to actually estimate erosion. And fortunately, we can implement this in SNAP Plus, right, which many of you are using for your nutrient management plans. And so, this begs the question, well, how good a tool is the Wisconsin Phosphorus Index? And I think this is where, Wisconsin's version of the P index has some advantages over, other approaches used by neighboring states. It's got a lot more sort of mechanistic detail. And so my colleague Laura Good in the soils department and her collaborators had a nice study a few years ago where they compared the predictions of phosphorus losses from the P index with 86 field years of real monitoring data from real Wisconsin farms. And in this study, they actually used the measured runoff and the precipitation to actually drive the model. So when you all are doing your nutrient management plans, you're typically using the long-term average climate from a given site to actually drive that phi index. But if we actually want to compare this with measurements, we really need to know what the weather was on a particular year. And so when we do this, the model, the P index model actually performs quite well with respect to the measured P losses from these fields. So the slope of this relationship is close to 1, which means it's not over or under predicting. And the R squared is 0.89. So the model is explaining about 89% of the variation in the data. So from a scientific perspective, I think we have some pretty good confidence that the P index is allowing us to rank fields in their risk of phosphorus loss, right? When we use the P index, we can't necessarily predict the phosphorus loss in any particular year, but given some long-term climate, we can predict which fields are likely to lose less or more as a function of their management. Okay, and so really our goal as part of this science assessment is to help us, leverage this tool of the phosphorus index to better understand and communicate the variation in the effectiveness of these different practices, within and across the diverse agricultural landscapes that we have in Wisconsin, right? Taking into account, all of the differences in soil properties that we have, at a field scale, but also sort of these broader scale regional differences that we have across Wisconsin in terms of climate and soil and differences in the prevailing cropping systems in a region. And so what we're going to do, again, my colleagues that are involved with this project in soil science are currently developing a batch tool for the latest version of SNAP Plus, which makes it a lot easier to run thousands of different scenarios without having to manually click through as you would in a typical nutrient management plan. And so what we're going to do is evaluate the P index across sort of a range of conditions, looking at sort of different characteristic soil series, climate regions, reductions, allowing for differences in soil test phosphorus, different crop rotations for Wisconsin, whether it's sort of traditional grain systems or dairy forage or other kinds of more diversified crop rotations, with or without cover crops, looking at differences in tillage practices for more, conventional tillage down to, decreased tillage intensity or even no-till, and also differences with respect to nutrient source and rate and timing. As well as vegetated buffers. So these are the kinds of things we're going to investigate more explicitly across our scenarios. Okay, so that's sort of that's one aspect of what we're seeking to do. The other is actually to better unpack some of the data that we have from Wisconsin Discovery Farms. So, this paper from Good and colleagues is from 2012. Thankfully, since then, we have accumulated, many more site years of data from working farms across Wisconsin where we've explicitly measured nutrient losses. Hopefully, we can dive into the details of actually what's driving the variability in those losses. So here's a map prepared by my colleague Ellen Albright that sort of shows where some of these recent Discovery Farms studies have actually taken place. We have a pretty good representation of different cropping systems across the state of Wisconsin, incorporating that geographic diversity as well as diversity in management practices. And so what we're seeking to do here is actually dive into some of this messier data to actually parse out the effects of different kinds of practices. And, I mentioned earlier that many of our neighboring states have relied on these sort of classical experimental designs where there's replicated treatments and controls. But for many of the practices that we're interested in, it's very, very difficult to actually evaluate those kinds of practices using sort of the most rigorous replicated approach. One example is a grass waterway. Many of you are familiar, right? That's taking, small areas of sort of convergent flow paths that are really vulnerable to erosion, taking those out of crop production, planting grass, right? And anecdotally, we know this can be highly effective at decreasing erosion, but it's really difficult to examine this from a classic field design, right? You have to have replicated fields that you randomly assign to waterway or no waterway. It's really sort of a tall ask for producers and, a logistical challenge. And so what we're actually going to do is use some more complicated statistical approaches to get at potential benefits of the grass waterways from a nutrient reduction perspective. So here's an example of sort of what we call a time series of phosphorus loss data from a Discovery Farm site where a grass waterway was installed. So we have some pre-monitoring data, and then we have the installation of the waterway, and then we have the post-treatment monitoring data. And if you believe your eyeballs, right, so these dots are individual phosphorus losses from individual rainfall events at the edge of the field, right? We have some of these large phosphorus losses at the beginning of the study. As we move on in time, there's much less here. We don't see those large P loss events. And so if we believe our eyeballs, we would think, well, maybe the waterway is doing something. Of course, from a policy perspective, we can't just trust our intuition here. Similar kind of a story with respect to total nitrogen yield reduction. It appears there might be something going on with the waterway. So how do we actually get at this? Well, fortunately, there have been some advances in statistical approaches for actually parsing out effects of management interventions in these kinds of situations where we don't have a neat classical experimental design. We're actually able to use these individual runoff events and actually model them. We're able to take into account different covariates that we know are important, things like runoff amount, the duration of a runoff event, peak discharge, whether or not a soil is frozen, right, which we know is especially important for phosphorus. And we can account for correlations among events that happen over a short period of time. And doing so, we can actually begin to parse out a quantitative reduction in the average nutrient loss after accounting for variation in these other factors and after accounting for the intervention in the site. In this case, it would be the installation of a grass waterway. So we're still working on the details here. Approximate results, we're seeing close to a 50% reduction in P loss from this particular site after the grass waterway installation. And again, we're able, with this approach to take into account the fact that, well, weather varies over time, right? We may have systematic differences in weather before and after a given practice was implemented. Thankfully here, this is showing you the runoff depth data from that particular grass waterway site. No systematic change in runoff, which is good, but we do see, right, this step change in phosphorus. So this is good news with respect to this particular practice. And so really the goal, right, this is one example of a specific practice, but to go back to the many site years of Discovery Farms data that we have access to and think more critically about differences in tillage practices, nutrient application, et cetera, to provide sort of more real world examples of how these play out on the landscape. I think this is a nice complement to this phosphorus index approach that I described earlier. Okay. So what are we hoping to provide to the community, right? Well, as part of our report, we're going to have some tables and figures sort of digesting all of this information, summarizing why and where certain practices may be more or less effective, sort of in a broad brush, view, right? Hopefully the goal is to help focus the conversation on what are some of the low-hanging fruit for practices that we could begin adopting and really targeting specific kinds of systems for specific kinds of practices. And really, hopefully, to start a conversation about how we can be most strategic in, encouraging adoption of practices across the state. And then again, complementing this with sort of real world data from Discovery Farms to help us flesh out some of these case studies with sort of benefits and potential real world limitations. So again, we're just starting on this. We've just sort of convened our team in the last few months. We're hoping that this sort of vision of a science assessment to complement these nutrient loss reduction strategies is really a long-term partnership. Sort of beyond, this effort that I described here, we're really hoping to get a better handle on the overall nutrient budgets for our state. Where is nitrogen and phosphorus coming from? Where is it going? Again, to sort of help guide the conversation with respect to low-hanging fruit. As Joe mentioned, our team is really open to feedback and input. Feel free to send me an email or ask some questions right now. And so that is all I have.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Stephen. We really appreciate being able to put a finer point on what does this new strategy or what does the science assessment part of the new strategy look like. It's very exciting. Just as a personal note, it's very exciting to see Discovery Farms be able to be used in these new statistical methods and being able to really account for differences in weather and things like that. So really, really excited about that. Okay, so we did have a couple of questions in the chat that were answered in written form. So make sure that you take a look at those. Like if you open up the Q&A, go to there's one tab that says open, and then there's one tab that says answered. So there, make sure you take a look at those. Stephen, there is one question in the chat that I think we'll just have you answer verbally. Is the P concentration in the waterway example a result of soil loss or soluble P?
So this is a good question. So I think the rephrase, is this soluble phosphorus or is it particulate? So those data that I showed are total phosphorus, essentially the sum of both of those. And yeah, we've actually done the modeling for soluble and particulate, and there's a little more nuance. So I think from a policy perspective, if we're thinking about lakes downstream, at the end of the day, the total is perhaps most relevant over the longer time scales. But absolutely, that's an important nuance that we're fleshing out in this.
Awesome. And then let's see, for Joe, I think there's maybe one more question in here about TMDL use. So for some phosphorus TMDLs, DNR has completed thousands of SNAP Plus runs to define baseline P loss from ag fields, and then has used SNAP Plus to estimate P reductions from one or more agricultural cropland practices. Oh, sorry, Stephen, I think this one's for you. Will the NLR Science Assessment Project use these existing TMDL data sets and results?
Yeah, we actually had a conversation with Carl about this earlier. Our approach is to do this more systematically, where we're actually, we're taking a higher view and actually going we may, end up duplicating some of that kind of work, but the goal is to make this more systematic and maybe more digestible to the broader audience, right? It's not just buried in a technical report somewhere, but hopefully more accessible and maybe more systematic in sort of evaluating the same practices across different regions of the state in a more explicit way. But I think it's very useful to highlight that this sort of approach has been done already. We're doing sort of hoping to flesh it out even more with this approach.
Awesome. Let's see. I don't see any more questions in the chat. Make sure as a participant that you do go and check out the ones that were listed that were answered with written comments earlier. So at this time, I'm going to see if I can share my screen to share the QR code for those that are looking for CCA credits. So you should now be seeing the QR code to scan and register with your phone for CCA credits for this session. If you have trouble scanning the code, please enter your CCA number in the chat box so we can submit that on your behalf. We're also now going to launch the last question, the poll for the last question. So this is an opportunity for you to tell us how effective this time you spent today was in terms of increasing your understanding of the nutrient reduction strategy, kind of past and present. And then also, it's an opportunity to indicate your interest in participating in the future to give input on the nutrient reduction strategy for the state of Wisconsin. So we really appreciate your time to take a minute to answer those questions. So again, we just want to thank you for spending your time today with us, for asking great questions. We really invite you to visit the Ag Water Quality Program website for more content like this on this topic. We're actively engaged in the state with lots of partners and also creating content on this uh, as well. The recording for all the webinars in the series will be uploaded to YouTube and linked on our website as well. We appreciate your time today. We would love to have you back in 2 weeks to hear about nitrogen leaching trends in the Midwest and local impacts in Wisconsin. So with that, I want to say have a great rest of your day and thanks again for being with us. Stephen, I do see there's one more question that was in the chat that must have come in while I wasn't looking at it anymore.
Yeah.
Um,
Happy to answer it if that person's still around or whatever.
yeah, I would say go ahead and answer it. And I don't know that we've quit recording yet. So.
Let's see which was that?
Given the earlier slide showing the increasing levels of nitrogen in our waters, will there be perhaps a second phase of the science assessment where we focus on nitrogen losses in ag production?
Absolutely. And I tried to speak to that. Given our sort of short timeline to produce something within the next year, we decided to focus on P here. But yes, I mean nitrogen's one of very much of interest by this team. So yeah, we hope to tackle that.
Awesome. Thank you.
And
All
Amber,
right.
for anyone who's left, I did include a link in the chat for anyone who would like to sign up for our, let's call it a listserv. It's a way to get regular updates about the nutrient loss reduction strategy. If you sign up, put your email in, then when we send out notices like of upcoming listening sessions and things like that, you will automatically be notified.